All right, everyone. Welcome to the Catchy G podcast, where my mission is for us to really listen and learn from my guests and figure out how we are great learning from our guests and how we can even be greater. And more importantly, how we as lawyers, as human beings, as professionals can bring this greatness that's in all of us to the world through our work, through our personal being, through our brand, whatever you want to call it. I do this podcast for two reasons. One, I truly care about humanity at a deep level, and I want us as lawyers to really see how deep our humanity runs and how great we really are, and that we deserve to be happier in our profession and at home and healthier as a result. And I also do it because, look, I'm just like you, and I struggle with my own feelings of being quote unquote less than. And some days are ugly, some days are great. But today is a great day because we have a fantastic guest for you. And I'm really grateful that he made time for us. Our guest today is Chris Newbold, and get ready for all his accolades. Chris is Chief Operating Officer and Executive Vice President of ALPS Lawyers Malpractice Insurance. He is the board president of the Institute for Wellbeing in the Law, and he has his own podcast, so go catch him over there. He's the co-host of the Path to Wellbeing in the Law podcast. And most importantly, which is what we want to talk about today, he's an advocate for advancing the legal profession. I love that language. Welcome, 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 Chris. So good to have you.
Thank you so much for having me, and thank you for all that you're doing to kind of advance the conversation.
Oh, my pleasure. I think it takes an entire village, as the saying goes. And, I was talking to somebody about that yesterday, that, I have certain attributes and you have certain attributes, and so does the next person. And when we come together and share those with the legal market, they'll benefit, maybe not from each one of us directly, but somebody will resonate and some message will work for them. Because I think we're at a crucial juncture. I just read a headline. It's from May. It said, "Why mental health in the legal profession is getting worse." And, you never want to read those, especially with someone like you and me working on this stuff. It's like, am I failing in what I'm trying to do? But before we get into that, which is why I do this podcast, because it's so important for all my listeners who are lawyers to really get a little bit of this even into their psyche. Let's start with Chris and his amazing background and experience. Tell us your story, whatever you want us to know, and maybe tell us something you don't want us to know, but we could benefit from knowing too.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting because, when I've been now involved in what I would kind of call the well-being movement, going back to the report that kind of served as a catalyst for the movement itself. In 2017, there was a report that was published, and then I happened to be invited to write a portion of that dealt with what lawyers, professional liability carriers could do as part of the solution, right? And so I consider myself in some respects an accidental leader in this movement, but in some respects, I also feel like I bring a lot of different interesting perspectives to the movement. I'm a first generation college graduate, which means I'm a first generation lawyer. We all deal, when you're first generation, anything with that sense of belonging. You deal with notions of what you went to law school for versus what happens in law school, and whether there's whether you end up in the place that you thought that you would, right? And I think that there's some really interesting elements to well-being and what I would call the expectations gap between what we thought it would be versus what it is, and how that can have some serious impact on it. And then again, and now I work and obviously I admittedly have an interest in wanting to see lawyers be healthy lawyers. Why? Because I run a malpractice insurance company, and we generally kind of can see that, the more that lawyers are challenged, the more that they're more likely to make an error, whether forced or unforced. And so, you kind of put all those together, and first and foremost, going back to my pre-law school days, I just loved organizational development and social change movements. And so, the ability to kind of put together strategy with culture shift, with a challenge and a problem, with a profession that's as important as the legal profession. I think back to the notions of, lawyers play such a important role in society as kind of a bedrock problem solver, which is a part of the fabric of a healthy democracy and the rule of law and all those kind of things. That if we're not getting this right, there's some of the basic core fabric of our company of our country could be at risk, right? And so, again, that's a little kind of pulling the lens way back on it, but I do think that
Absolutely.
healthy lawyers feed a healthy legal system, and our ability to be able to be a high functioning society depends on the health and well being of lawyers, and so that's why my company ALPS and I have been so prone to want to lean in on this particular issue.
Healthy legal system. That's interesting. Do you ever think have we ever looked at what would different people consider healthy legal systems? Some would consider probably being able to be adversarial and getting the juggernaut the other party and taking them down healthy. I think you and I look at that differently, right? Though,
Yeah,
how
yeah.
do you define a healthy legal system? Because I like pulling the lens back because the broad picture is where we have to start, and then we need to narrow it down.
Yeah, and I think the core of it ultimately is, are we helping in the conflicts inherent in society in a way that allows for people to resolve issues and then come out of those issues and thrive, right? And I put a lot of the health of the legal system also in the context of the access to justice challenges that we face, because
Yes.
when we're not able to meet the legal needs of certainly not low income individuals throughout society, but even middle class individuals who sit there and say, I can't go and pay a lawyer to do something of which I don't know what the outcome is going to be. I don't know how much it's going to cost. And just kind of thinking about it in that context. So, again, I fundamentally believe that, lawyers are so important in terms of that ability to be able to be available to, in part of the legal service delivery model, that, we just need to make sure that those of us licensed and actively engaged are ones who are operating at what I would call peak performance, and that we're providing the resources necessary for a holistic approach to well-being. A lot of times when you think about well-being, there's a tendency to kind of go towards some of the elements that our friends in the lawyer assistance program world deal with, right? Which is substance abuse and suicidal thoughts. And don't get me wrong, those issues are critically important as part of this compact that we have amongst each other within the legal profession. But it's also just kind of ordinary lawyers working every day, raising families and juggling balance and the ability to prosper in ways, because you and I know it's hard out there, right? It's hard. Things are changing fast. New technologies are coming on board. Expectations of clients are evolving, and I think some of the challenges on the mental health side of things are just the fact that the business model and how we deliver legal services is constantly evolving and constantly changing, and it doesn't allow you to unplug as frequently as we used to.
Well said. I just remember practicing securities law, and it wasn't just in the delivery, but it was the substantive part for me too. Like I would sit down every morning and read about an hour's worth of content to see what had changed overnight. I kid you not, in my practice. Yes, I was tied to the market some, but it was really that plus the management of having to run the practice, even though I was always with an organization. I was either in-house or with a firm or with the federal government, but still the big word I think is overwhelm. And I like what you said about holistic, because oftentimes when I speak to law firms or lawyers about well-being, I always have to start with, this isn't about salads and meditation and deep breathing. Those are important too, and so is what you said about suicide and everything else. It's just it goes so much deeper than that into things like financial well-being
Correct.
and every aspect that as I call it, it's about harmony and managing the ebbs and flows. My expertise is in transitions,
Mhm.
and every aspect of our life has a transition involved in it, whether you're graduating, whether you're getting a divorce, whether you're starting a practice, whether you're growing a practice. And transitions lead to stress, right? And stress and loneliness is what I find. I've said to you, Chris, and to others too, I'm kind of lonely in my consulting practice because this is how I do it. I'm always online with people. I miss being with people, and we don't emotionally resonate with our audiences. And that emotional resonance, I have found, is the key to health and longevity, where we figure out where those connections lie and how our unique connections and emotional resonance helps. And I found that the law is based on precedent. So it means that it's hard for us as lawyers, with our occupation and our mindset being so good substantively. And I concur with you. I always say it's such a noble profession. If we just could dial it in to where we care about ourselves as much as we care about our clients, we'd be really, really doing well. But it's hard for us as lawyers to shift gears and see the bigger picture and focus on our own needs and flexing a little bit more. And tell me, what have you seen in this area around all, I know you guys do a lot of research and a lot of good work. What are you seeing as the biggest most urgent needs right now? For anyone listening, listen very closely and see where this falls, either even remotely in line to what you're going through, if you have somebody in your firm, or if there's some symptoms going on, and we'll address how you can be part of the solution for yourself and for others.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of where the dialogue is moving, and I'm actually I'm forever the optimist, right? That
We have to be.
there's a couple of things that are kind of moving in what I would call a healthy direction. One would be society in general is talking about these issues much more thoughtfully. All right. And so that opens up an opportunity for us to naturally, as lawyers, be more vulnerable, right? I would love to be able to see a world in which a struggling associate has the confidence to walk into a senior partner and have a thoughtful discussion about what's going on in their life. Don't get me wrong, that happens, but more often than not, there's a fear based upon what that vulnerability will do from a perception as to how will that be interpreted and how will I be valued in
Mhm.
my organization, right? And you think about that, right? You think about,
Well, can
um,
I just stop you
yeah,
right there? It's almost like what we need there is a reframe
yep,
on what makes you a good lawyer is your ability to tap into your emotions and go and communicate it to somebody else, because
correct.
that's the same strength that you need to connect with your client. If you cannot connect with your emotions, you cannot communicate with that client, you cannot service them well. Now, there are lawyers like me who are listening with my practice area. I mean, my clients were always the big mutual funds, the heavy lifters. I rarely saw a human being on the other end to connect to. And that's part of the problem, right? That there's this loneliness factor associated with that that's gotten worse. I mean, pre-pandemic, many years ago when I was practicing, it wasn't really a thing, but life goes on and circumstances exacerbate, that's the word I'm looking for, our situation. So do you think that's a solution we should be focusing on for these lawyers?
Absolutely. And again, I think, if I think about your listeners to this podcast, we all have the ability to be influencers of our culture, right?
Mm,
Whether it's your occupational culture, whether it's the manner in which you value relationships within your particular legal community, the civility and the professionalism that I think most lawyers would probably acknowledge is on the decline, not the upswing, and in part because we just don't know each other as well as we used to, right? And
mhm,
you have a
mhm.
pandemic, and then you go remote, and then you're getting your CLE, through a computer. And there's just kind of a notion of we don't know as many people as we used to know. We don't value the relationships as kind of thoughtfully as we used to. So in some respects, you're kind of swimming upstream on some of those things. But with society talking about it more, obviously, I think most people would acknowledge that generationally, the next generation is just much more mindful of the type of work-life balance that they ultimately want to have as a means of framing what professional success looks like, right? It's not always the $250,000 salary. And so we need to be continuing to be just, again, thinking about what does that mean for who's coming into the profession? Sometimes you get the thought, and I want to acknowledge it, that a lot of folks think well-being is a license to be able to say not work hard. And I don't think that that's not what anybody is saying, right?
No.
I think we all understand that, when you come into a professional environment, that part of it is again being valued in your work, feeling a sense of belonging, feeling a sense that your work matters, it's appreciated, it's recognized, and that the notion that this next generation is not willing to work hard, I just think is inherently false, right?
And
But go ahead.
I think that leads to friction between my generation and the next generation. I had a partner at a major law firm say to me not too long ago, he said, well, we have a soft mandate to be back in the office for 3 days. And the majority of us partners actually are. And he said, but the associates are not. And they're
Yeah.
just balking. And they're saying, I don't need to. He said, but the problem is that creates friction between us and we don't see them as much. So we can't assign them work. So how do we manage to that, really acknowledging 100% that this has no bearing on who's lazy and who's not? It's productivity is productivity, and especially in the world of law, I mean, your billables prove it, right? You're
Yeah.
either doing the work or you're not. But how do we acknowledge that friction that happens between the generations? And I mean, I come from a generation where well-being was not even a topic. We just didn't talk about it.
Yeah.
It didn't matter. But it has to be looked at because, like the headline said, mental health in the legal profession is getting worse. And so we can't just turn a blind eye to it. What do you
Yeah.
think?
No, it's part of why people have um, a positive outlook on remote work is in part for some of the well-being considerations that they're factoring in: hour-long commutes, other types of things where they're and so I think you got to recognize that. I think you need to just acknowledge that there are going to be trade-offs. I think I have probably a bias that I value in-person connectivity, right? But
Me too.
everyone's going to come at it from a different perspective. I think most organizations are thinking about it as to what type of culture do we want to build, and how do we effectuate that culture, whether it's in person, remote, or a combination of the two. And just again acknowledging that there are differences. I happen to believe that and I think the science is already starting to prove this out in some respect, that those who are physically present probably have greater likelihood of things like promotion, right? Or mentorship, or other elements that are important to career development that some people may want and some people may not want, right? And so, again, I think you just got to start to kind of understand that stuff's changing, right? And there's going to be trade-offs in how you ultimately select and how that ultimately manifests its way into a career. At the end of the day, you're right. Production's production, but there are elements of production on the periphery that can have some real ramifications for how people are seen within cultures.
Absolutely. And that's a key phrase. I concur with you. How people are seen. Most lawyers, I think, come from a vantage point, at least in the old days, that, it's just your work product. No one gives two hoots about anything else. Just get the work done. But in a world where people are looking bigger picture and saying, what do you stand for, with ESG and everything so important, I think it's foolish to not step back and look at that. But I have had lawyers say to me, quite honestly, we don't want to focus on wellness because we don't want to detract from the billable. And so I understand that, and I love their honesty, but there's so much education that needs to be done to prove what you and I are just saying, that that's not the case. It doesn't detract. And here's how it adds to the billables. And then we get into the whole retention and engagement
Yeah,
conversation.
I mean, if your work is valued and respected and recognized, it generally feeds a bucket that has people generally liking what they're doing and willing to give more, right? So again, I talk to a lot of well-being proponents, most of them being in big law, who are more looking at well-being as a pathway toward peak productivity, right? Which again, when you think about your occupational well-being, your spiritual, your relationship well-being, your physical well-being. I mean, there's so many contexts of well-being that can easily be compartmentalized, but in the aggregate add up to how are you doing and how well are you doing relative to your both your professional and your personal responsibilities. Because, again, oftentimes most of us can't divorce the two.
No. And I think to what you're saying, it's about being willing to step back and say, I like my profession and I'm allowed to enjoy my work. I find that that's not true for a lot of lawyers. Uh, professions in general. I mean, my husband's a dentist, so we talk about it a lot in dentistry. And, they have the highest suicide rate, or maybe they're neck and neck now with lawyers. But sometimes I look around at professionals who have advanced degrees, and it's like, well, I didn't go to school to enjoy my work. I went to school, and I'm like, finish that sentence thoughtfully, please. It's fine that you went to make money because you grew up, your story is that you didn't have money or you didn't have the accolades. That was my story. I'm an immigrant. I went because I couldn't stand the sight of blood, and I wasn't going to be an engineer because I'm like, oh man, I can't handle that life because I'm such an extrovert. So I was like, law it is, right? And I had a great career, but I'm not sure I was of that ilk that I should enjoy what I do
Yeah, and
until the day I burnt out.
I've taken the liberty in most of my public speaking engagements over the last couple of years. There's one question that I will ask a large audience that has always crystallized the reality of where I think that I can conclude that we have a problem, and that is a simple question: would you advise your son or daughter, if they asked, to go to law school? And generally speaking, between 25 and 40% of the room will actually raise their hand, right? If we had this profession, I think, dialed correctly, I just think that more hands in the room would naturally go up. There's something that holds lawyers back of almost kind of saying, I wouldn't wish this life upon my offspring. And then I think then you have to kind of start peeling back the onion layers and saying, why? Why is it that we are in this place where, we haven't been able to extract the type of professional satisfaction that at the end of the day, you would sit there and go, I've loved being a lawyer. I loved the people that I've served, the clients that I've served, the problems that I've solved. And I would encourage anybody interested in a legal career to ultimately go to law school. That's just simply not the recommendation that most lawyers would give to people who asked.
No, and you would think the law schools would jump all over that and try to find the solution faster than the rest of us, right? Because what that's encouraging is less students, obviously. And I don't know what the solution is for law schools from that vantage point, but it's everyone's issue, I suppose, is what I'm saying from you guys, which obviously makes a lot of sense because, if you're tired, you're exhausted at whatever level, mentally, physically, emotionally stressed, and you don't see support around you, you're going to make mistakes. You're going to slip
Correct.
up. And, no lawyer wants to do that on purpose. I have yet to meet someone who wants to jeopardize their license and all the blood, sweat, and tears you went through. I put myself through law school. I'm sure a lot of my listeners have the same life choices they made doing that, but it's definitely something that happened. So we're all invested in this. What do you say to those who say there's no solution? All we do is we talk big picture and we do research.
Yeah, I think we see solutions and we see positive stories all the time. I mean, I think one of the central hallmarks of engineering this culture shift that so many of us yearn for in the legal profession is to normalize the challenges that people face, to hear the stories where people have went in challenging directions, yet emerged and thrived within the profession, right? And so I think more often than not, I think we need, particularly our seasoned attorneys, our judges, our, folks who are role models in our profession to be vulnerable and talk about some of the challenges that they've faced in their legal career. I live in beautiful Missoula, Montana. We got rivers running through town, right? And I think about the river concept, right? Where, rivers take interesting bends, and then there's nice straightaways, and then the water levels will pick up and they'll slow down, and there'll be rapids and sharp turns, slight turns, right? That's life, right? And the manner in which you can manage that river, your own river, right? I do a lot of strategic planning facilitation for state bars. And one of the questions I'll ask as we're getting to know one another is, give me two turns in your bend that ultimately changed the direction of where your professional life ultimately went. And you'll hear just encouraging, rewarding stories about people taking risks and saying, I didn't want to be there. I went over here. And as a result, I'm a much better, person, husband, wife, professional, father, mother, whatever it is, because people have that ability to look at themselves and say, this is not what I want. My fear is that a lot of folks, particularly in the legal profession, get boxed in to a life that they don't see a way out from. And a lot
Yes.
of that is from, you thought practicing law was going to be one thing. You ended up taking a job doing another thing. That thing isn't exactly where your passion lies, where you get, where you feel rewarded from. You got, X number of dollars of law school debt hanging over your head. You got your parents saying, you can't not be a lawyer, right? You just went to law school. Like, you got all these kind of pressures on you. And then you have a tendency to stay in a place that's just not right for you, right? But
We're
it
all
takes enormous
courage.
willpower and courage to be able to take that. You've taken some of those leaps.
Well, yeah, I was going to say you're almost describing my story, except that I had paid off my student debt when I stopped practicing law. But yeah, I mean, I think I've shared with you offline. My mother was like, "Well, I was always so proud to tell my friends, as an immigrant, that my daughter's a lawyer. What do I tell them you are now?" And I remember I mulled over that one for years. I was like, "I believe I'm a human being and not a lawyer. That is just what I did for a living." And so then it is a concept of being trapped. We're doing actually a continuing legal education for those of you who are listening in September at the ABA called The Trapped Lawyer. And it really does feel like we have no choices. And I want to say that comes from a place of not slowing down long enough to get to know ourselves and to listen to our inner guidance, whatever you want to call that. I'm not here to make this the spiritual hour, and none of this is meant to be woo woo, but it really is about intrinsically what we think of ourselves. And we don't think highly of ourselves. I mean, I'm constantly working on that for myself in bits and pieces, cleaning up my doo doo here and there. And why do I think this way about myself? And why don't I see myself worthy of this and that? And it's painful. And who has time for that, right? When you have
Mm-hmm.
all these other things going on in your life. So I guess what I would say is your advice, if I'm saying it correctly for the audience, is take one little thing Chris has said today that we've discussed and try it on. Try being a little more expressive and effusive. And as I say, take the mask off a little bit with the guy at the grocery store, with perhaps your spouse, with someone in your life. Practice this. Yes, you don't have to go all out vulnerable and quit your job like I did because I was so stressed, but we want you to start feeling into who you are and really integrate it into your practice. Is that fair advice,
Yeah,
Chris?
I think it is. And ultimately, you know, evaluate your own habits, because your habits will ultimately um, center you as to the type, as to what your identity is, right? And if it small incremental changes, particularly in your habits, and knowing that who you want to be. A lot of times we set a goal, we meet the goal, and then we fall right back into the place that put us, into the place that we didn't want to be in the first place, right? I think a lot of it has to do with who do you want to be, and then creating the types of habits that allow you to be the very best that you want to be. And a lot of that, you'll learn through your personal journey, but having that ability to be self-reflective as to what's feeding healthy behaviors and what's feeding destructive behaviors. I think that those ultimately will help kind of define the ebbs and flows of who you will ultimately be as a lawyer and as a professional.
Now, final question in this portion: as someone who spends a lot of time developing brands for lawyers as a tool to that sense of well-being, who do you want to be has to be prefaced with who am I, right?
Correct. I mean, I say this a lot. Who are we before we're lawyers? We're human beings, right? And we're all, I think you got to kind of boil it back to the human being element of, it's challenging out there. It's not easy. Lots of different pressures out there, but working hard and trying to figure out who do you want to be, and then building around that identity of who you are and who you both who you are and who you want to be will go a long way, I think, ultimately in the journey that you take.
And I'm sure everybody who's listening is going, oh my gosh, that sounds so complicated and difficult. And who wants to look at who I am? Because
break it down, small steps.
Yeah, break it down in small steps for sure. Listen to Chris, he knows what he's talking about. And also, you've done way harder. Going to law school took a lot of courage and a lot of, sleepless nights. And so we've overcome a lot of adversity. So I believe really stepping back into our resiliency and looking at how remarkable we really are that we made it through law school. I mean, I don't think we ever stop and really pat ourselves on the back because it was so many years ago and so many people have done it and all sorts of reasons, but we have done tough things, and counseling clients is a tough thing. So we have done tougher things, and this is just part of the process of transformation and growth. So
That's right.
Is that a fair place to leave part one?
It is, yeah.
Awesome. So now my audience always likes to see where your cutting edge is. What's going on in your world that has you thoughtful, introspective? What's a challenge you're dealing with? And how can we work through it together?
Yeah. I mean, for me, and I'll move into the I will portion of this, because, it's a real honor for me to be somewhere near the epicenter of working to figure out where do we go with an issue that a lot of lawyers are very passionate about because of their personal experiences. And so, I think it's really interesting to be able to look at other industry verticals that have undergone culture shifts where you have the ability to put well-being as a core centerpiece of professional success. And I think the one area that I'm trying to put more thought into, because I think it's both underappreciated and it's hard, is the plight of the solo practitioner. 49% of lawyers in private practice are solo practitioners. And so while a lot of lawyers listening in to this podcast are, part of larger organizations, larger communities, the stress and the realities of managing your own law firm, sometimes with support staff, oftentimes without support staff, and the unique challenges that they face in both running a business, serving clients, dealing with the ups and downs without a support network naturally built around them, and oftentimes compartmentalized from their personal life, because most people just don't want to go home and dump all those issues on their spouse. I think that's one of the more notable challenges in the well-being movement is, what are the most appropriate pathways to be able to support and build community among a group of lawyers who can feel isolated, frankly, from others. It's not to say that they don't have great relationships, but as we know, it's a little easier to walk down the hall and talk to somebody, or somebody ask, how are you doing? And if there's nobody there, what happens to those lawyers? And we see, we insure about 70% of the lawyers that we insure at ALPS, they are solo practitioners. And we're seeing evidence of a greater degree of transiency in that population of coming and going. And it worries me, because I think in most bar associations, they are the kind of the lifeblood of the membership. And I think it's really hard to develop tailored solutions to that particular community of our legal profession.
That's a very fair concern to have. And I really respect you tremendously for putting those folks not first necessarily, but somewhere really high on the list because, well, we're all humans and we're all lawyers. It just depends on what shape that practice takes. And I can say I've never been a solo, but I've consulted with plenty of solos and they have all your issues. And thank goodness for the technology tools and the Clios of the world that really make their life manageable. However, being married to a dentist who's solo, I mean, it's almost, you see the similarities because there
Mhm.
is that lack of support built into the profession. So I believe, and sometimes they'll say, well, Chris and Ketty, you've never been solo. I don't think you haven't been a solo practitioner either, have you? No.
Uh,
So
uh,
then,
yeah. But
no,
I try to put my, obviously we talk to our solos often to try to understand where
exactly.
we, I guess again as their insurer can help them. But again, that's easier said than done. Let's just put it that way.
Yeah, exactly, and that's the best we can do to empathize. However, I have found that in my approach with what I do is the individualized customization of programming, and really that's really why I think one-on-one coaches exist if people would take the time. And I don't think anything beats the one-on-one concept or the small group to one concept. And here's why. I know myself, I always have a coach and I'm always in that looking for that one on one. And especially introverts look for that. And that's why a lot of people become solos, I found, right?
Mhm.
Because they're like,
That's right.
I can't handle all those people and I'm good at this and I'm going to keep my head down and do what I do. Fabulous. But we need someone to say, you're special, you're important, you matter, you're not alone. And it used to always ruffle my feathers. I'm like, I can't believe I have to pay someone to tell me that. Well, why should I have to pay someone to tell me that, right? For my own coaches. But now I'm like, I don't care how that comes my way, but if somebody's willing to really honor me and listen to me, whatever I'm babbling about for an hour, it's different than therapy because therapy sometimes looks at it, but go get a therapist is what I would say if you're listening to this and want to know a place to start. I found therapy is more about, where are broken edges and let me listen to you. We need that. We also, though, need someone to say that could be a problem, but coaching comes from a place of everyone is whole and healthy, no one's broken, and how can we take them from good to great? And that, I think, really inspires solos to say, I am not alone. And when you just sit and say, I've heard that problem before, and I've heard that problem before, and here's your solution, and here's something for you to think about, slowly the concepts integrate, and you have to take it at people's paces. Solos are solos because they like the individual approach.
Yep.
And so you can't mass market that way to them because it doesn't solve their capacity to take in learning and transform. That's what I would say. And then the problem becomes, well, what do I do? I've got 70% of solos. Why do I match them up one on one with a coach? Well, there's those that are never going to take you up on that. And there's those that, we have a feeder model that we can put them into where even if it's an hour that makes that solo stop thinking a certain way that could lead to choices that we wouldn't want for them, let's just put it that way, then I think that's worth the thought. And
Yeah.
it takes away the loneliness factor. And I can imagine being in Montana. I've never been, I've always wanted to go, but there's a lot of loneliness for solos. Just let's just take your state, right? That
Yeah.
people don't feel like there's vast open spaces. I had a client. She was a solo in Iowa, and, I grew up in Indiana, so I thought there was a lot of people around her. She goes, no, I live in a part of Iowa where like there's me and then there's the next lawyers like miles and miles away, right? And so that really was what we worked on a lot. That
Yeah.
that understanding that, okay, well, are you comfortable reaching out? No, I don't have time. I've got a family. What am I supposed to do? It's miserable. I also hear this from solos a lot. I'm in this small town and I want to bring diversity in. I want to hire someone diverse. One, there's no one around that looks different than any of us here in this small town. And two, I'm not sure my clients would allow that to happen. So we have a lot of those conversations too around values in terms of our health and the stresses that we want to keep down so our self-confidence goes up. So I would say keep looking at the customization, individualized, tailored, what do solos need? And generally they all need the same attention, but they need different things when that attention spotlight lands on
Yeah,
them.
I
Does
think
that
that's
make
right.
sense?
And again, just appreciate for the listeners out there the magnitude of the community. I mean, if there are 1.3 million lawyers in the United States, back of the envelope numbers would indicate that probably around 400,000 of them are solos, right? So you're talking about a fairly large number, right? That are facing again some just unique and different challenges. And that's why, again, if you've seen one lawyer, you've seen one lawyer. Rural, urban, different areas of practice, different stages of career, different ethnicities, different, you just kind of put together the myriad of all the ways that we're different as lawyers. And it's really hard to develop solutions that are applicable to all, right? And so it's hard.
Yeah, but at the end of the day, we all have our humanity and we all have the same genetic basic stressor, things that raise our stress, things that increase our self-confidence, and we know that much. So I tend to focus on the obvious because the obvious puts people in control and empowers them rather than makes them feel like they don't count and they don't matter. So, um, final thoughts for us before I let you go. What should be the last thing our audience knows?
I would just say again, if that if you're listening to this, I think you're probably already a proponent of thinking that our profession needs to continue to work toward betterment, and a great pathway for people to become engaged and become more active in the culture shift that's necessary is by being actively engaged in the Institute for Wellbeing and Law. Right, this was the organization that basically was the successor to the former National Task Force on Lawyer Wellbeing. I think we appreciate that we've been moving away from that term lawyer well-being and moving intentionally toward well-being in law, because even the people who are not lawyers in our respective offices, they're involved in the legal profession, right? And we have to be more inclusive and create a sense of belonging that they're just as important in this culture shift as anybody else. And so, again, if this issue speaks to you, look up I will lawyerwellbeing.net. Become part of the movement. It's a big tent, right? And there's a lot of people who I know that it's hard to vie for people's volunteer time. But what I do know is that the people who have gotten involved in this issue, that have personal stake in having things that have occurred to them, that they'd like to see the profession move in a better way. We need more passionate advocates to come in and be part of the solution and not just kind of watch. And I mean, you're getting it in CLEs, you're seeing it at your annual meeting, you're seeing, don't get me wrong, there's more attention on this issue than I think that there's ever been, at least in my 2 decades watching the profession. But that doesn't still mean that we need people to kind of be even stronger advocates. And I think I will is a great stepping stone to that engagement.
I love it. So check that organization out. It's a great place with some brilliant minds like Chris, who, by the way, don't have any more time than you do, but they're willing. And that I'm not saying that you're a bad person for not doing it so far. I'm just saying there's always time if we decide what is important to us and what we place at the forefront. And
Right.
hopefully, this is important to you because it's about our humanity as people and helping our clients out. And anywhere else they can reach you for content, Chris, or should they just go to that website?
Yeah,
That
just go to the website, hit me up on LinkedIn. I would love to hear from folks. And again, I think that some of the challenges when you think about technology and isolation, and I'd like to think that we're moving toward progress, but it's not going to come easy, and it's going to take a lot of hard work, and it's going to take a lot of lawyers who are willing to eliminate and reduce the stigmas that are out there, be more vulnerable, be really honest about the type of work environment that they want to create for the people who are within that particular organization. I certainly am excited about where we're heading, but know that we got tough challenges ahead of us.
We sure do. But if it wasn't challenging, it'd be no fun when we get
That's
to the
right. I mean, in some respects, yeah, I run an insurance company, but I think that perhaps my greatest legacy back to the profession will be the work that I'm doing right here.
Amen. Well said. And thank you. Thank you so much for your time into this topic for the profession. And thanks for making time for me, because this all takes time. Look, you guys, he put in his time, and I'm hoping that it was useful to you. Take away one nugget, implement it, do it slowly. There's no rush. This issue will always, unfortunately, be there. And if you think you yourself can't be part of the solution, that's just wrong. You're much more powerful and strong than you think you are. And we need you, and we welcome you. And I want to thank Chris again. And until next time, next episode, Catchy G out.